Several factors obviously contributed to this, including the extent to which Western countries themselves, particularly in Europe, began to be less willing to invest quite as heavily in military activities to maintain fully cutting-edge military technologies. First, beyond this, several other parts of the world began to emphasize new military tactics that could stalemate the West's advantage in conventional armament. The big development here, it wasn't new, but it became more important. The big development here was the success of guerrilla warfare in places like Vietnam, but also, as it turns out, if you look at Algeria and then more recently Iraq, the capacity of resistance elements in urban settings also successfully to resist the overwhelming superiority of Western armaments. The West's military advantage, uncontested still, could obviously be almost nullified by the emphasis on these renewed strategies. Second, as individual countries, even middle-sized countries outside the West, gained independence and gained some measure of growing economic capacity, one of the things they did with these two developments was to invest in increasingly significant military force, which meant that the capacity of small numbers of Western troops easily to move into a country like Iraq was actually gone. The West, of course, could still defeat middle-sized countries, but it took a lot more planning. It took a lot more economic commitment, like the huge buildup before the Gulf War of the early 1990s. And obviously, as Iraq would later demonstrate, even that kind of military success, though possible in one sense, didn't really assure victory. So, point one. From the 15th century onward, on the whole, the West had been gaining increasing military advantage over other societies, first on the seas, then in the long 19th century on land as well. The contemporary period of world history saw this trend interrupted, not eliminated yet, but interrupted, and the West's military action in the wider world became more complicated and more contested. Related to this was the second key development: the West's capacity to control most of the rest of the world directly through colonies and colonial administrations clearly ended in the contemporary period of world history, which means that one of the really key developments beginning between the wars, and again, World War I is a valid starting point, and accelerating after World War II, one of the key developments in setting the framework for this new period in world history was the movement of decolonization. The West's willingness or inability to resist the formation of independent nations where colonies or significant Western enclaves had previously predominated. Now, of course, Western political and economic influence could survive decolonization in some cases, but the political map of the world became not just more detailed in terms of the huge increase in the number of independent nations, but more complicated in the sense of a much reduced capacity of any single civilization or society to dominate the world politically. Relative military decline, clear political decline, some new competition in the economic sphere, which again we'll detail in fuller sense in our next session. These developments marked a clear termination of one of the dominant themes of the long 19th century, setting the stage, obviously, for other themes to take their place. What's the final outcome? Again, I have to come back to uncertainty. Some people argue that the relative decline of the West will ultimately yield predominance of another civilization, and probably the most common candidate is East Asia. But although we've had many world history periods, the post-classical, the long 19th century, in which one civilization really did wield a power position much greater than others, There's no inherent reason for this to be the next pattern. Maybe there will be greater balance among several sectors in the world, either harmoniously, relatively speaking, or amid great tension. Again, we don't know the end of the story. All we know is that the story is largely new. Several new themes do begin, I think, to gain ascendancy in this contemporary period of world history. Themes that were only sketched, hinted at, or prepared in the long 19th century previously. A couple of candidates need to be mentioned, and then I want to turn to what seem to me to be the two crucial ones. First of all, obviously, some centuries hence, people may look back at the contemporary period of world history and say, the fundamental innovation in this period was the beginning of humankind's conquest of outer space. And I'm perfectly willing, hoping that our societies last long enough for this to be possible, I'm perfectly willing for this verdict to be rendered. But in the early 21st century, although space exploration has occurred, it has not yet had sufficiently deep impact on the nature of human life or the main patterns of global societies for me to do more than list the possibility for a future retrospective. A more serious candidate is the altered nature of war in the 20th century and the altered nature of military technology. The two world wars were what some observers have described as total war. That is, they mobilized all the major resources of key combatants, not just armies and navies, but the economy harnessed to the war effort, propaganda tying civilians into the emotional qualities of war. And there was a third total war in the later 20th century, the several years conflict between Iran and Iraq. Add to this, obviously, the fact that World War II ushered in a new military technology that could, as far as anyone knows, bring human life and perhaps life in general to an end in the world, nuclear military capacity. And you have a possible formula, one of the key new themes of the contemporary era in world history, clearly different from patterns previously, involved heightened organizational capacity in war, the fact that all resources could be bent to the conflict, and societies insist on total surrender as a result of this investment, plus the new and devastating and fearsome new technology, and maybe this has reshaped world affairs more generally. I'm not, frankly, absolutely sure. Many wars continue to be conducted at slightly less awesome rates. World diplomacy has not been entirely reshaped by the nuclear threat. So put this down as a possible, and maybe with an asterisk, we hope this will not become one of the defining characteristics of the new world history period. The two that I think are, again, in addition to the negative, the relative decline of the West, the two themes that I do think deserve clear emphasis are, first of all, massive global population increase. The 20th century saw a tripling of world populations from about 2 billion to over 6 billion, and the process would clearly continue at least into the middle of the 21st century. At that point, declining birth rates may usher in a new demographic regime, among other things featuring the growing aging of societies, and maybe all bets will be off. But for the moment, this huge surge in global populations is a noteworthy phenomenon in its own right. Never before had world populations increased so rapidly in such a short span of time. And it carries over into a number of other definable features that begin to reshape the world, although there had been a couple of hints in the latter stages of the long 19th century. For example, world population explosion clearly helps encourage new patterns of immigration. And instead of immigration largely consisting of movements of peoples to societies that were, broadly speaking, culturally somewhat similar to points of origin, immigration, particularly by the later 20th century, though there were hints even in the 1920s and 30s, immigration now increasingly consists of peoples moving from Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, to particularly Western societies, not just the U.S. now, but Western Europe, as well as, of course, Canada, Australia, and to a limited extent even to Japan. Movements that bring people from much different cultural backgrounds together, that constitute a much more interesting mix and possibly a more challenging, intenser mix than most migration patterns had previously involved. So, population explosion vital in itself, leading to new types of immigration patterns and new challenges to many societies in the process.